I am just so delighted to be with you all today. And I want to begin with gratitude first to Kate for inviting me to participate and to the American Weil Society leadership for the fantastic work they're doing to connect Weil scholars. And to all of you for choosing to spend time with me here today. I'd also like to express my gratitude for the land in which I'm grounded today, which is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and gratitude for the South Saskatchewan River watershed, which gives me life every day, and gratitude for the Indigenous peoples of this place who have been rooted here in reciprocal relationships since time immemorial. Our project today is to discuss Simone Weil's essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, in the context of Weil and literature. I'll speak for about 45 minutes and then leave the second half of our time for conversation. And I want to say, I suspect some of you today have been reading this essay closely for decades and will have plenty to say about it. And I know that others of you could be entirely new to it. So I hope that our discussion can extend a valuable conversation for the whole range of Weil's readers. We'll begin with a little history of the document and then move into a close reading of the essay. And then finally, we'll extend ourselves out to a little contemporary poetry. But first, I should situate myself in the conversation. I am an English professor, as Kate said, not a philosopher, but my work has always been interdisciplinary. I sometimes do describe my research and teaching as existing at the intersection of contemporary Anglophone literatures, especially literature by women, religion, especially Christianity, and justice, so both philosophical ethics and justice movements. This intersection draws me to study imaginative writing and theory involved in feminisms and decolonial movements and liberationist theologies, which are not always common conversation partners in literary studies. This intersection also drew me to Simone Weil. My doctoral dissertation at Loyola University Chicago was invested in the ethical turn in literary studies, which often borrowed from the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas to theorize a kind of endless, self-emptying, sacrificial responsibility for the other. The literary theory seldom acknowledged the religious echoes, like a theology of kenosis or Christ self-emptying in this language. And it also seldom acknowledged the gendered echoes of women's self-sacrifice. So I was crafting this ambitious interdisciplinary multi-author project, bringing together contemporary women writers like Adrienne Rich and Toni Morrison and Anna Castillo and Chimamanda Adichie with postmodern ethics and feminist and liberation and postcolonial theologies. So in that conversation, I was familiar with Vey in passing, but I was also familiar with her in part because my husband had read her work in a class on the Trinity for his master's degree of theology. So I knew he had read her there, and as I was working on my chapter about Adrienne Rich, I kept recognizing references to Vey, and it flummoxed me. I was fascinated and bewildered by how a leader in the mid-century feminist critique of self-sacrifice could find so much in Vey, who was herself so drawn to Christic self-emptying in her later work. So I picked up Josh's copy of Waiting for God. This is a photograph of that book here. And I saw that Rich had literally written a cover endorsement for this 1970s paperback. So I sat down and read the whole thing in a day. And that was, 17 years ago, and I've been reading it ever since. If you read the book that I published in 2016 out of that dissertation, that's the Book of Women Born, you see that Vey is there, but I had to hold back on the bigger question of Vey's appeal to Rich and these other writers. And so I worked on that project, honestly, for more than a decade before my book, The Literary Afterlives of Simone Weil, came out in 2024. This book looks at Vey's extraordinary popularity among contemporary Anglophone literatures. As it turns out, Adrienne Rich began reading Vey in the mid-1960s and continued a lifelong writerly conversation with Vey until Rich's death in 2012. And the famous American nonfiction writer Annie Dillard likewise drew on Vey throughout her career, although often without attribution. The novelist Mary Gordon has written multiple books with Wei's life at the center, including a novella called Simone Weil in New York. And we find Wei's influence in Anne Carson, Sarah Clausen, Stephanie Strickland, a venerable member of the Weil Society here today, I believe. Laura Neal Singlen, Kate Daniels, Sigrid Nunez, Emner Bessie Phillip, Casey Schwartz, Flannery O'Connor, Terry Tempest Williams, Fanny Howe, Mary Carr. The list could go on. And it also could include men like T.S. Eliot and Christian Wyman, Edward Hirsch, Geoffrey Hill, Seamus Heaney, and Robert Lowell. In my estimation, the most intensively, persistently engaged Anglophone literary interlocutors with Weil have been women, and often, interestingly, white women. But her influence is prevalent in fiction, poetry, and literary nonfiction in every decade since her work began to appear in English. It seems that in every decade, people describe a resurgence of Simone Weil. Weil loved literature, and literary writers since her death have reciprocally loved Weil in various and sometimes competing ways. Even when our conversations about Weil are more specifically philosophical or political or theological, I think it helps to recognize that another site of genuinely insightful work on her legacy is the poetic. Some of these literary writers are among her more astute interpreters and challengers, respectful and nuanced readers and conversation partners. For her part, Vey was a respectful an interpreter and challenger and a nuanced reader of the Homeric text. So now I'd like for us to turn to a brief overview of the publication history of her essay on the Iliad and how it came to the English-speaking world. I draw here on Jane Doring's account of that history in her 2010 book, Simone Weil and the Spectre of Self-Perpetuating Force. Wei's essay on the Iliad was first published in the literary magazine Cahiers du Sud in December 1940 and January 1941 under her pseudonym Emile Novi. It helps to remember the history of this time. The UK and France had declared war on Germany after its invasion of Poland in September 1939, and then Germany moved on France in May 1940. Weil was reading and translating Homer and writing this piece as she lived through those events. And Simone Petrament reports in her biography that Weil could spend half an hour on a line of the Greek. Doring highlights how Wei's work came to be championed by Dwight MacDonald, then editor of the American journal Politics, from 1944 to 1945. So he printed a translation of Wei's essay Reflections on War in 1945, a year and a half after her death, as the Second World War continued to rage. Horrified by the US's use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th of that year, MacDonald quoted Weil in his front page editorial, and so I've included an excerpt from that on the slide. He writes, "The concepts war and progress are now obsolete." Going on, atomic bombs are the natural product of the kind of society we have created. And then he concludes, must we now conclude with Simone Weil that the technical aspect of war today is the evil regardless of political factors? Can one imagine that the atomic bomb could ever be used in good cause? This is the context in which we must read the publication of Wei's essay on the Iliad in MacDonald's journal. That August, after the bombs, MacDonald's friend, the novelist and literary critic Mary McCarthy, sat on a beach on Cape Cod and translated the essay, with MacDonald translating the excerpts they quoted from Greek to English. McCarthy famously got sand in her typewriter. I don't know if you've all heard this story, but she got sand in her typewriter while she translated. But the essay was ready for the November 1945 issue of Politics. It made an enormous impression. Writing decades later, Elizabeth Hardwick wrote, in the 1945 publication of Simone Weil's essay, The Iliad, or The Poem of Force, in Dwight MacDonald's magazine Politics, in a translation by Mary McCarthy, was, it is no exaggeration to say, an event of great importance to those of us who read it. This is one of the most moving and original literary essays ever written. Hardwick, incidentally, was one of the founders of the New York Review of Books, And Susan Sontag contributed her very famous profile of Simone Weil to the inaugural issue of that publication in 1963. And then Hardwick herself contributed a profile of Weil to the inaugural issue of the important feminist journal Signs in 1975. So these circles and kind of networks of intellectual life, they kept spreading her influence on and on. So, what makes Weil's essay so important, not only for those readers in 1945, but for us now? What explains its continuing appeal? Doring links the original response to readers' horror at the atomic bomb. Hardwick also names the piece's originality and emotional appeal. Scholars of the Iliad will be quick to tell you that Vey makes interpretive mistakes, perhaps, and prioritizes her support for her own argument in her translation choices. Her essay is not engaged with the scholarly approach to the Homeric tradition of her own time or of ours. Nevertheless, many classicists know and love this essay, which I think tells us something about its value as well. So let's turn now to the essay itself. They begins with a frank assertion of her thesis. This forthrightness is consistent with the entire essay in both the original French and McCarthy's English translation here. It is precise and spare at the level of the sentence and also as a whole. Literary-minded readers notice this about Weil's prose style in general. It's economical, but it's also very pleasant to read. Here's the opening assertion. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad, is force. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. This claim departs from many common interpretations of the epic poem. Typically, the presumed hero of the Iliad is maybe Achilles, the greatest of Greek warriors, whose anger drives so much of the plot. Or perhaps the true hero of the Iliad is Hector, the great Trojan warrior who nobly fights to protect his people. Readers generally see the subject of the poem as the Trojan War, the wrath of Achilles, and the broader themes of military glory and honor, rage, fate, the role of Olympian gods in human drama. These themes have attracted listeners and readers for millennia. To prepare for this talk, I decided to reread the Iliad in Emily Wilson's 2023 translation, which is rendered in a propulsive iambic pentameter. I was reading it out loud in my living room one day near my kids, and I ended up in a battle scene with a lot of descriptions of spears striking people between the nipples. That's a direct quotation, it's repeated. It got a little gory, so I stopped reading, but my son sidled up to me with wide eyes and he climbed into the chair next to me and he said, "Keep reading, Mom." He was hooked. A week or so later, we had friends over for dinner and we're talking about our recent reading. And my son said, "Mom, did you tell them about the death book?" It took me a minute and then I realized he meant the Iliad. All of this is to say, in popular imagination, much of what has kept people coming back to the epic poem, I think, is kind of like what draws people to Marvel movies. Vivid fight scenes, sweeping battles, and then this deeply human concern at the center of characters' motivation. For her part, Emily Wilson argues in her translator's note that the Iliad aestheticizes and glorifies violence, and any reader or listener ought to understand the excitement and joy of holding a weapon and plunging it into the soft flesh of an enemy. So Weil's opening assertion presents itself as quite a contrast to these popular readings of the hero, the subject, the center of the Iliad. Because if we keep reading her first paragraph, we see that Weil's assessment of force is not at all celebratory. In this work, she writes, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. Notice the breadth of this assertion in the phrase "at all times." Weil is making a bold, all-encompassing interpretive poem about, or claim about the poem. And let us remember that this is a 24-book epic. In Wilson's translation, it is 640 pages long before notes. I'm told that audiobook versions are at least 14 hours long. Notice also the negative connotations in the language Fay uses to describe the effects of force. It doesn't just modify the human spirit, it sweeps away, blinds, and ultimately deforms the human spirit. The listed effects are increasingly negative. I think it's also interesting that Fay uses the passive voice here, which is true in the French as well as the English. The very phrasing emphasizes the relative passivity of the human spirit in its encounters with force, which takes over the action. Importantly, the second half of Vey's first paragraph moves immediately to claims about how force and the Iliad relate to the contemporary moment, giving us an indication from the outset that this essay is not just about literary criticism, but an application to the world in which she currently lives. For those dreamers who consider that force, thanks to progress, would soon be a thing of the past, she writes, the Iliad could appear as an historical document. For others whose powers of recognition are more acute and who perceive force today as yesterday as the very center of human history, the Iliad is the purest and loveliest of mirrors. I love how she throws a bit of shade at the dreamers who believe in a meta-narrative of progress here, in contrast to those whose powers of recognition are more acute and thereby aligned with her own. Vey is arguing that the Iliad is a pure and lovely mirror for a truly unlovely reality, that is, the centrality of force that she saw in World War II and perhaps experienced from a distance as a child in World War I, not to mention the many violent oppressions of Hitler's regime more broadly. Just a few years later, MacDonald, McCarthy, Hardwick, and others would similarly see the Iliad, or perhaps Vey's essay about the Iliad, as a mirror clearly reflecting the horrific power of force in the nightmare of nuclear warfare. A question we might return to then would be what the Iliad and Vey's interpretation of it reflects to us now in 2025. Vey is engaging in what scholars in my discipline sometimes call moral criticism, which involves looking at a literary text and amplifying its ethical lessons for readers. The project of moral criticism leads Fay to emphasize this ethical lesson above all over other possible approaches to the poem, and to a degree above any other complexities or nuances. She's making a particular point to make a particular lesson clear. In her second paragraph, Fay quickly moves to explain her terminology. To define force, she famously writes, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse of him. Somebody was here, and the next minute there is nobody here at all. This is a spectacle the Iliad never wearies of showing us. A quotation from the epic poem follows, and this is the pattern that emerges throughout much of the essay, kind of a rhythmic back and forth between her argument and block-quoted translations from the Greek epic. It feels like a conversation, this back and forth, or perhaps a distinct warp and weft kind of weaving. By my count, in this 24-page English version of the essay, Vey quotes something like 268 lines of the Homeric epic. Again, in the original, her own translation is from the Greek. The quoted poem functions as evidence for Vey's close reading claims, but her choice to quote not just words or phrases, but full lines or groups of lines also gives the poem a kind of dignified centrality. Readers of her essay also become readers of the Iliad. We are invited into the careful and appreciative attention Vey herself is paying to the text. We are also invited into a triangulated relationship whereby these extensive primary text quotations allow us to assess Vey's interpretive claims and also notice our own competing or additional insights. After these initial paragraphs, Vey's argument moves into a discussion of contrasts and comparisons in Homeric poetics, the gradient of force's consequences, and the remarkable equity she sees at the heart of the Iliad, where force spares neither those who wield it nor those who are victim to it, and where it favors neither side in the ongoing war, but moves inevitably from one side to another in a manner the characters can't always recognize, but we as readers do. She ends by broadening her conversation from literary to cultural critique, bringing her moral reading of the poem to bear on her contemporary society. One of the contrasts they highlights is the contrast between the brutal realism of the violent scenes of war. No comforting fiction intervenes, she says, against the quickly passing references to another world, the faraway, precarious, touching world of peace and family. I love the line at the top of the essay's second page where she talks about Achilles being far from hot baths. Nearly all the Iliad takes place far from hot baths. Nearly all human life then and now takes place far from hot baths, she says. It's kind of dryly funny, but the line is poignant when you think about Wei's own family's pressured migrations from occupied France. She goes on to discuss not just force that turns a person into a thing as a literal corpse, but force that does not kill just yet, turning a human being into a thing while he is still alive. That's on page 7. Through fear, through a freeze or fawn response in the face of extreme violent threat, through significant power differences, whereby the presence of a powerful person inevitably implicitly shapes our actions, and through slavery, which she claims turns a person into a compromise between a man and a corpse, death strung out over a whole lifetime. I don't think Vey is meaning at all to dehumanize enslaved people here. I think she's emphasizing the absolute outrage of slavery. This is also a part of the essay that emphasizes the particular vulnerability of women and children. And every time I read it, I think of how aptly it applies to Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. Vey next discusses how force overcomes not just its victim, but also the one who wields it, intoxicating those who ostensibly possess it. Furthermore, force quickly changes sides with its marked contrast between the power dynamics, which is a marked contrast, pardon me, between the marked power dynamics of Homer's epic and something like the entrenched racialized power of North American chattel slavery, where force does not historically change sides back and forth. Vey doesn't name this example in particular, but I think it helps us see more clearly what she's naming as the remarkable equity at the heart of the Iliad. Agamemnon humiliates Achilles, she notes, but a few days pass and now the supreme commander is weeping in his turn. In fact, she writes, there's not a single one of the combatants who is spared the shameful experience of fear. The heroes quake like everybody else, and fear quickly changes sides. Like weeping and fear, defeat too changes sides quickly back and forth. No one in this poem permanently wields power due to their superior strength or glory. It's on loan from fate, she writes. Later, she writes that dignity, or destiny rather, is in control here, not the characters themselves, which suggests a profound leveling, a kind of brotherhood in the vulnerability of not really being in control. But those who possess force at any point in time almost never see that they are not, in fact, naturally and perpetually endowed with it, Vey writes. They count on it too much and exceed it, and the inevitable consequence is a reversal of their luck. Expanding her view, she writes, this retribution, which has a geometrical rigor, which operates automatically to penalize the abuse of force, was the main subject of Greek thought. She notes that Western cultures have sadly lost this sense of balance in our sense of virtue. Ultimately, Vey notes, with this self-leveling geometry, the progress of war in the Iliad is simply a continual game of seesaw. And still, the one who possesses force in any given moment, even if he'd been at its mercy the moment prior, forgets its nature to shift back and forth between Greeks and Trojans. He embraces it entirely, A moderate use of force, Vey writes, which alone would enable man to escape being enmeshed in its machinery, would require superhuman virtue, which is as rare as dignity in weakness. This superhuman virtue also requires reason, which is rare in wartime. In the middle section of the essay, Vey expands on the ways war requires that soldiers embrace a series of delusions, overestimating their capacities at a distance, approaching the experiences as a game, and losing themselves to force in order to cope with the horrors of war's actual threats. Once you acknowledge death to be a practical possibility, she writes, the thought of it becomes unendurable except in flashes. To cope with this fear and their extreme losses, soldiers allow force to distract them from the harshest truths, trading destruction for destruction, trapped in a kind of sunk cost fallacy that almost never allows those enmeshed in these mechanisms to extract themselves through moderation and reason. The soldier himself, she writes on page 22, becomes a thing, a tool of force possessed by war. Vey notes that one of the epic's poetic strategies, its prevalent use of similes, emphasizes this passivity. The similes compare the warriors to fire, flood, wind, wild beasts, or to frightened animals, trees, water, and sand. Forces of nature that wreak havoc, or objects in nature that are moved by such havoc, but generally lacking agency and reason. For Vey, the overwhelming presence of destruction, violence, obliteration, and despair combine in the Iliad to make a picture of uniform horror, of which force is the sole hero. But again, she reminds us of the contrast against this horror. Those few luminous moments scattered here and there throughout the poem, those brief celestial moments in which man possesses his soul. These are moments of courage and love, moments of hospitality, of love between parents and children, of brotherly love, conjugal love, friendship, and finally, the purest triumph of love, the crowning grace of war, friendship that floods the hearts of mortal enemies. The sharp contrast between grace and violence, she insists, casts the violence in sharp relief, making us see its costs with unflinching clarity. In the last few pages of the essay, Vey crescendos to her final commentary on the poem before a denouement into broader application. Pages 25 and 26 are perhaps my favorite in the essay, as Vey ties together her argument about the contrast between violence and grace, the inescapable leveling power of force, and the tenderness of the epic as a whole. It is in this, it is that the Iliad is absolutely unique, she writes, in this bitterness that proceeds from tenderness and that spreads over the whole human race, impartial as sunlight. Throughout the epic, she asserts nothing precious is scorned, and whatever is destroyed is regretted, not just for the Greeks, but also for the Trojans. In fact, the enemy's misfortunes are possibly more deeply felt. The poem doesn't celebrate one side and dehumanize the other. It insists on the full, vulnerable, imperfect humanity of every single character, even in a 10-year war. The poem doesn't mourn the losses of the protagonists and celebrate the losses of the antagonists. It refuses to romanticize, in Vey's reading, any violence, any loss, and it wraps in poetry whatever war destroys or threatens. This, Vey argues, results in the extraordinary sense of equity which breathes through the Iliad. I can't help seeing this vision of equity and insistent universal humanity as a contrast to our current moment of winner takes all antagonistic politics, polarizations that dehumanize opponents, and a kind of normalized cruelty and banalized meanness, a worshiping of power that, and not just fear, but a villainization of outsiders. In other writings, Faye suggests that she saw this kind of antagonistic power mongering in Hitler. I suspect her first English translators also saw the outrage of the United States' own capitulations to force when it wielded the nuclear upper hand. Somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people died in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention the additional long-term effects among the living. Something like 90% of those who died in the initial bombings were civilians. Weil opens out the essay in her final pages, though, not to explicit political commentary, but to literary and cultural commentary. She compares the Iliad to other Western literary texts and finds them lacking. The Odyssey seems merely a good imitation. Honestly, I always liked it better, but don't tell anyone. The Aeneid is even worse. The Chanson de Roland doesn't show enemy love. She sees the genius of the Iliad there a bit in Attic tragedy, and much later in Villon, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Molière, and just once in Racine. In between these historical moments, though, they see some of the genius of the Iliad in the Christian Gospels, and particularly in the suffering of Christ, who trembles like the Homeric heroes in the face of death, and having tasted human misery, rather than distancing himself from it, can also inhabit justice and love. To truly love others as we love ourselves, Faye insists, we must know that we are just as likely to fall into abject suffering as any other human. We cannot imagine ourselves above fate's vicissitudes. We certainly can't imagine ourselves as invincible, and from that position truly love others, not to mention our enemies. Vey notes that it's rare to see misfortune fairly portrayed, since we tend to either blame the unfortunate person or minimize the effects of misfortune. In their capacity to avoid this mistake, they contrast the ancient Greeks with the Romans and the biblical Hebrews. The Romans, she claims, had contempt for strangers, enemies, conquered peoples, subjects, and slaves. In her reading, the Hebrew scriptures paint misfortune as a sure indication of sin and hence a legitimate object of contempt. Apart perhaps from the book of Job, the so-called Old Testament, according to Vey, departs entirely from the Greek Testament sense of equity and tenderness. She proceeds in the next paragraph to also critique the early Christians whose joyful martyrdoms relied upon an illusion of grace in the face of the force that killed them, to imagine they could tremble less than even Christ in the face of their suffering. Finally, she critiques later Christians for their blindness to the ways force is at work in the coercive missionary project of forced proselytization. This abrupt turn in the second to last page of the essay opens up a can of worms for contemporary interpreters, and we can discuss these challenges more in our conversation today, if you like. Vey's literary interlocutors have certainly taken up her low estimation of the biblical Hebrew nation. It's central to Mary Gordon's novella, for example, and Emmanuel Levinas famously called Vey bad at reading the Hebrew Bible. But it's important to note that many of Vey's concerns with nationalist supremacies, divine mandates to apparent genocide and land occupation, with a theology that equates all suffering with divine punishment, are concerns that people within the tradition have grappled with and continue to do. I wonder sometimes what would happen if Simone Weil were to study Torah with Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, a vivid example in our day of that faithful grappling. Because I think the way Weil ends this essay refuses not just supremacies, but also blithe misreadings of any tradition. Having downgraded all modern European literature as a shadow of the Homeric epic, Weil makes her final pronouncement. Perhaps they will yet rediscover the epic genius when they learn that there is no refuge from fate. Learn not to admire force, not to hate the enemy, nor scorn the unfortunate. How soon this will happen is another question. I think it bears repeating. Learn that there is no refuge from fate. Learn not to admire force. Learn not to hate the enemy. Learn not to scorn the unfortunate. These are ethical principles, as I noted at the outset. Weil is making a final claim that great literature, artistic genius, will only return when moral goodness, moral beauty, likewise returns to Western culture. Her claim here is both aesthetic and ethical, but ultimately the aesthetic here, the literary criticism, acts primarily in service to the ethical lesson. We have so much to talk about. We could say so much more about this essay, so much more about the Iliad itself, so very much more about the echoes of political application, past and present. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation, the conversation we can weave together here today. But first, I want to end with a single poem that reminds us that just as Vey turned to literature to explicate ethics for her day, literary writers have turned to Vey as they forge a literature responsive and responsible to their own times. It's an ongoing reciprocity, I would say, between philosophy and literature. So the poem that I'm calling us to is called Reading the Iliad as If for the First Time by Adrienne Rich. The poem was composed in 2009, some 55 years after Rich first read Vey, and was published in the collection Tonight No Poetry Will Serve. I'll read it aloud here, offer a few brief comments, and then open up our time to discussion. So, reading the Iliad as if for the first time. Lurid, garish, gash-rended creature struggles to rise, to run with dripping belly. Blood making everything more real pounds in the spear thruster's arm as in the gunman's neck the offhand moment, now, before he takes the bastards out. Splendor in black and ochre on a Grecian urn, beauty as truth, the sea as background, stricken with black long-oared ships, onshore chariots, shields, grieved muscled legs, horses rearing, beauty, flesh before gangrene. Mind-shifting gods rush back and forth, delusion, a daughter seized by the hair, swung out to bewilder men. Everything here is conflictual and is called man's fate. Ugly glory. Open-eyed wounds feed enormous flies, hoofs slicken on blood glaze. Horses turn away their heads weeping equine tears. Beauty? A wall with names of the fallen from both sides. Passionate objectivity. Again, there is so much we could say. First, note Rich's use of both enjambment, where the sentences continue across lines, and internal spaces, which ask us to pause but maintain a relation in the line. There's a kind of jagged continuity here, a gash rending, even in the poetics, but also a momentum of war that reminds me of Vey's claim about the seesawing of fate. Second, note the tension within the poem between beauty and brutality. The word beauty appears first as a neutral claim, a not subtle wink at Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and then an exclamation point, and then a question mark. The beauty of the Keatsian second stanza is ultimately recognized as flesh before gangrene. The wound is inevitably coming. Third, note how the poem's final insistence on ugly glory is unflinchingly vivid. The invented word blood glaze, the feeding flies, the weeping horse refuse any aestheticization of war. And finally, note how the poem's last lines, describing a wall with names of the fallen from both sides, suggest a modern war memorial linking the ancient epic to 21st century war and memorialization practices. But also note how the both sides and passionate objectivity align with Vey's sense of miraculous equity in the epic, meaning a mourning not just for one side, but for all the lost, a kind of equitable humanity. If you read this poem in Rich's collection and don't know Vey's essay, you won't recognize its influence. But if you're familiar with Vey's essay on the Iliad, and if you know about Rich's 6-decade engagement with Vey's work, you see it, I think, in every line. You could tell me I'm reading too much into things, but then you turn to page 83 in the book and you find Rich's note on the poem that directly quotes the second half of Vey's first paragraph in the essay we've been studying today. I think Rich's poem crystallizes much of what's crucial in Vey's essay about the Homeric poem, inviting a 21st century audience into an ongoing poetry-mediated ethical struggle with power and violence and dehumanization. And we are a 21st century audience. So now I'd love for us to enter into that dialoguing work together. And I thank you so much for your attention today.
Wow, Cindy, thank you so much. That was incredible. We'll open it up for questions, so we can just use the raise hand function, and Cindy, if you're all right with it, you can just call out on people and we can go in order of people's
Sure
raising.
thing.
Wonderful.
Gary, go for it.
Two questions, actually. The first one, if I may, the first one is about uh, this poem of force as an underlying basis for fascism. Someone told me that this was a good document to read in that vein.
So, in terms of an underlying document to resist fascism or an underlying document in support of fascism, could you say a little bit more?
Was describing the roots or reason for fascism, that fascism is an outcome of our current politics, and this is the reason why.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to hear from other people in the Zoom room on this as well, but I think that the V's reading of this kind of championing of force and this kind of forgetfulness of the way force does actually move around in a lot of our society where we worship power. I think that that's consistent with her reading. I also think she writes a lot about these things in The Need for Roots, which is another place that I would look to kind of dialogue um, about fascism in particular. But yeah, I'd love to hear if other people have thoughts on that. David?
Thank you. Boy, that was just a wonderful, wonderful talk. I enjoyed it. One thing that you didn't mention was some of the beautiful accounts of supplication of Achilles, of the the begging of Hector before Achilles, and it reminded me of Vey's discussion of the Melian dialogue in Thucydides in the implicit forms of the love of God, where you get the interplay between justice and mercy. And I thought that the account of equity we get at the end of this essay is in many ways similar to the account of justice that we and love that we get in the implicit love of God, and also in the Pythagorean doctrine in some of the other essays and in intimations of Christianity in the ancient Greeks. I wonder if you have thoughts about those scenes of begging. They're so beautiful in the Iliad. Of Hector and Priam, begging before Achilles, and the brutal coldness with which it's responded. The same we get in the Melian dialogue, that the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and is maybe a little bit like above my pay grade in that I wish I were more of a classicist in that I feel like I would have more to say in engagement with the original text and the other tradition. But I think that those scenes of supplication, those scenes of begging, the kind of humility implied there is I can think of so many places where Vey is really attentive in her writing to the ways that fate or whatever it may be can lead people into that position of needing to beg or just to be aided. And sometimes they meet that help and sometimes they really don't. And I feel like the Iliad is really beautiful in portraying that, like, um, just the impossibility of escaping being a person who could fall into that necessity, but also the cruelty that can happen when you're met just without any compassion or without any real responsiveness. So that's what comes to mind for me. And I do see it throughout her work. Do you have anything else to draw our attention to, David?
Well, just in the implicit love of God, and this is true in the Pythagorean doctrine as well. They stresses the way in which even a type of kindness can fail to recognize the equality of the other, right? So even there are some acts of graciousness in the Iliad as well, and honor, and even the sense of honor there does so by engaging the person to whom you're kind or to whom you withdraw the threat of force as into a type of obligation. And she thinks the equity that's involved in the end of this is the same as the type of proportion that we get in justice, where you consent to the independent existence of both sides. And she thinks that's a common feature of both friendship and justice and love.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful reflection, and it draws together a lot of parts of Vey's thought that we all often see treated kind of separately. Like it draws together her writing on friendship, and it draws together her writing here, but then also the way she writes about reading and needing to kind of reread each other and reread the world. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Teresa, yeah.
So, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to add just one thing about this question of fascism and force. And I think that when it comes to the origins of fascism, there's one more element that they would stress, which is this desire for greatness and this ignorance that the real greatness is not about expansion, which is said in the Need for Roots. And this is where this desire to use force starts.
Yeah, that's such a really beautiful point to amplify. And I think further on the point about fascism, I think it's really interesting that in his book on tyranny, Timothy Snyder cites Vey all the way through. It drives me a little crazy that it's not a book that's easily footnoted, like it has the kind of hidden footnotes at the end. So you don't get to trace in without doing a lot of homework, all of the influence. But I think the fact that Vey is appearing in one of the foremost Anglophone 21st century writers who's writing about fascism and tyranny, I think is a really important point. Even though Snyder himself, I don't think is like a specialized scholar of Vey, right? But the fact that her work is making its way into these broader discussions, I think is a indicator of how important it is as a resource for now. Dirk? Oh, you're muted.
Cindy, I just want to thank you very much for that very articulate and encouraging interpretation of this poem. I have a technical question. I'm much more familiar with another English translation. You must be aware of it, right? But the one by Elizabeth Geisbuller from 1958 that appears in Intimation of Christianity Among the Ancient Greeks. And I was wondering, is there a reason why you chose Mary McCarthy's as opposed to Elizabeth Geisbuller's?
That's a great question. I chose Mary McCarthy's because it was the first to appear in English, and because in my book research and in the work that I've done, I'm often really interested in reception history. So I like to look at the kind of intellectual history of how documents reach different people at different times. And Mary McCarthy's translation, because it was the one published in 1945 and then reprinted in this edition we have distributed to this group from 1965. But also, I checked this out from our library. This is one of the original like Pendle Hill pamphlet editions of it. This is Mary McCarthy's edition as well. And so I think that other translations, you know, like calling force might and things like that, like they amplify our understanding of the essay. But this one is the one that I think, especially in its earliest Anglophone reception, had the broadest influence. But I haven't actually reread other translations recently, but I think it would be a really interesting conversation to have about the relative merits of different interpretive choices.
Okay, so you haven't chosen this one because it's necessarily superior translation. It's just because of its context in which
Yeah,
it was.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
I would not feel qualified to make an argument about the better translation or the best at this point. But I do think that would be a really interesting conversation to have if we could read and discuss the relative merits. Ryan?
Yeah, Cindy, I really loved your talk. Thank you so much. I have a question if you could say more about how Simone Weil is defining or redefining ethics, because I mean, at least the way I read the essay, she's kind of imploring us not to make ethical judgments of participants in war, right? That like even in Need for Roots, like it's, you can't ethically judge Hitler, there's like a larger force. So how is she making us rethink ethics that doesn't closely align to how 20th century discourse was using ethics?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a deep philosophy dive. I feel like there is this kind of question about the role of the normative in the 20th and 21st century, right? My first book on literary ethics, when it was included in my tenure and promotion file, one of the anonymous external reviewers of my file, the only comment that my dean gave me from them is that they said, this makes some normative claims and that makes me uncomfortable. And so there's this sort of tension that we have, right, between a kind of broader awareness. And I think you're right that they here, it's true. Like all of the participants here are sort of subject to this broader force, and they're kind of like pawns. And that doesn't even actually, like, that's even apart from the discussion of fate and the role of the gods and all of their machinations, right? Um, on the matter of Hitler, do you really think she gives him a pass in the Need for Roots all the way?
I'll let someone else jump in, but I think like her naming or like critiquing Hitlerism, right?
Yeah,
So that
exactly.
like kind of that ethical judgment, if it's just like you remove a Hitler and we can go back to normal, it's just more
Yeah,
again, it seems to be like a force, almost like Hitlerism, right? Something that,
yeah, fair.
but but I'll let other people jump in that are more
Yeah.
knowledgeable.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think because, yeah, so Hitler then is sort of a figurehead of a movement, and Hitler himself isn't necessary to the movement. And it is about this sort of amplified role of power and of prestige, right? And that kind of builds its own momentum and acts as its own kind of gravity, right? It sort of has its own center of gravity. I definitely see that. The way that that challenges us in terms of a kind of ethical application, I think is a really important question. And I think maybe some people have opinions about that. For me, I feel like it comes back in the end of the essay to those sort of, these are some calls of what people need to do. And I wonder about the role of the individual and the communal in that space and the tension between like what is the role of a person, because they always wanted to maintain that, right? Like she hated groupthink. So what is the role of an individual's ethical choices? But then how do those kind of intersect with like a culture, because she's very interested in a cultural tradition as well. And I think that those things are maybe a little bit in tension here, because I think she is calling for particular changes and particular actions that have an ethics, but that you're right, like the broader sense is that the force itself has a kind of it has a kind of presence of its own. So Dirk and then Scott, do you have thoughts on that?
If I recall the Need for Roots correctly, in that I think Simone Weil has read Mein Kampf by Hitler, and she takes him to task for his belief that force is supreme in the universe. And that's why Hitler has allied himself to force. And what she does is she says, no, there is something else there that is alongside force, and that is in the heart of every human being, a cry for justice. That there is something in the universe which transcends force, and really to which force is subject in some mysterious way in what she calls necessity. But there is something there, like she argues against Hitler's assertion. And what I appreciate about that is, rather than demonizing him right away, she attacks his argument, which is pivotal. And so I'm not saying that she humanizes Hitler, but she takes on his major tenet, which is driving his belief.
I like that. I like the idea of her taking on the major tenet driving his belief. Scott, do you have more to add to that or complicate that?
Uh, yeah, I was actually going to simplify it because although I generally agree with Dirk's analysis, I mean, Vey doesn't waste time making a metaphysical or even ideological critique of Hitler and Hitlerism and the need for roots. She says that he needs to be banished from history, right? Like she compares him to Richelieu, who she thinks is the worst person in the history of the world until Hitler, for wiping out the various different forms of life in sort of pre-centralization France. And the whole book is about, yes, sure. Hypothetically, the book is about what to do about the workers' movement after the liberation of France. But the whole book is about how to get rid of Hitler and make sure that de Gaulle doesn't become French Hitler. And so in the need for roots. I wanted to ask a question though about the Iliad essay. And this is what as well, because I'm really sympathetic to your reading, Cindy, and I really appreciate it. And I'm curious as to I forgot what my question was.
It'll come. Let it come.
It'll come back to me. I'll let
Okay.
someone else go. I'm sorry.
Good. No worries.
Just
Stephanie.
lost my train of.
Well, I wanted to say maybe three things. One is I thought that one of the things she says about Hitler is doesn't have any aspirations that Napoleon didn't. And Napoleon, much, beloved by the French, and also it's just kind of like, it's another one of those even-handed things in a way, right? The other, she says also that the way force acts with geometrical rigor, and how that hasn't been appreciated since the Greeks, except in technical discussions. So that this kind of even-handedness of the way physical forces seek equilibrium and so on. And I think she thinks that a typical Greek understanding of virtue is not different than their understanding of physics. And that is something that is actually important to her. And then she says also that anybody who fails to understand how force acts on another person and can't see what that is going to be taken in by this belief that they deserve it, and that by contrast, this person, deserves their elevated state, and they're not going to win, and so on. So that at the heart of it is really some kind of teaching. It can be physical about going back and forth, but it can be framed in terms of empathy, we might say, between you need to have that understanding of what's happening to the people around you, which notably in our present government, certain of us do not. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, that's I think really helpful, Stephanie. The idea of the force being something that both moves back and forth in this sort of physical might sense, but also the need for empathy and compassion, and the need. I often think one of the more recent people kind of thinking about this is Judith Butler, thinking about vulnerability, and vulnerability is something that sort of grounds us all. And I remember, so it's a distinction, right, between vulnerability and precarity. It's been a long time since I read this, but the idea that we are all vulnerable, and that's something that we need to recognize as a kind of equalizing human need. But we are variably precarious in this world, and that's also something that we need to recognize as a kind of inequity that has kind of requirements of justice. And so, yeah, I think that importantly, the essay, and one of the reasons why it's been so meaningful to people, is because it's not just about war, right? It's about the human condition more broadly. But I see lots of hands. Jack, you're next on my screen.
Thank you. I have come to Simone Weil very recently in the last few months. I'm actually a film scholar,
Lovely.
and this essay is, of what I've read, I have a long way to go, but of the work that I've read, this is my favorite essay. And I don't think it's I don't think it's just an essay about a poem. I think it is a poem. Okay, the essay is a poem. And I see this as about partly about Weil's ambivalence. Okay, I was impressed and also, I have to say, amused by her behavior during the Spanish Civil War, where she tried to be a pacifist and a warrior at the same time, which is kind of strange. And I see that as both tragic and somehow heroic. And I think that kind of ambivalence is informing the essay in some sense. The sense that war is wrong, but the sense that that aggression must somehow be dealt with, and I think the essay reflects those ambivalences in her. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
well, and we know that they kind of grappled with the place of pacifism in her lifetime, and we know that in the period of composing this essay, right, the kind of reality was that France had been entered into the condition of war. Like there wasn't really an alternative at that point. Um, there wasn't a clear way out. And so I think she's very committed to grappling with what is real and not pretending easier kind of fictions of a happy solution. And so that's something again that I think people have really appreciated about this essay, is that even as it kind of argues about the horrors of war and violence and the way power works in the world in this kind of like geometrical kind of way, it doesn't pretend that they're not there. Like it's insistent on seriously struggling with those realities. Kate, you're next in my lineup.
So I had a couple of things to say. One, I was thinking about this, the kind of balancing grace with force, and it does strike me, I guess, to almost go back to David's suggestion of that moment of supplication as being that X which allows for grace, like that this is kind of the balancing. So she gives us the X that is force kind of implied behind that in the moments of supplication, particularly. May be this possibility of grace to balance, and that too is then also the inverse of force that takes away subjectivity or makes the subject an object. Grace is that which brings it back, the moment that allows finally Achilles to see another human as a subject after Patroclus' death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also, you really this whole conversation got me thinking a lot about the moment that Patroclus steps in as Achilles, steps into the battle as Achilles, and what that means to give oneself as ransom for the other, and what that could look like when, you know, he dies for that. And so that's a little bit half baked, but also I'm really going to dive back into that. So and then the other thing that I was thinking about with this idea of the ethically problematic claim, perhaps, of both oppressor and oppressed being kind of equally subject to force in this way, or dominated by force in this way. I think we have to look at this claim as something that happens before law and order, or punishment, or that this is, you know, punishment may and should come along after the fact. But what we're thinking here is, are all human beings in this kind of originary sense worthy of dignity and respect? And the answer has to be yes. And so and then what is it that we as a society are going to do about that? That's a question that kind of comes further down the road. But what she's doing here is something that comes before that ethically. And so I think it's important to note, especially when we're looking at people like Hitler, is it to say that within this structure, it's not that he gets away with it or he gets off. It's rather that she's talking about something radically different, of human dignity before we move into that law and order.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kate. And it makes me think, that last point you made about how many how productively we can read this essay with others of Wei's essays and other writing. We've been talking about the need for root sum, but that point about human dignity makes me think of the essay that I often read under the title Human Personality, which is one that was so important to Adrienne Rich, for example, because it argues that there is this kind of universal sense in us, like, why am I being hurt? Like, we know that we ought not to be subjected to force in this way. And that's another sort of starting point into a conversation that I think we need maybe more than one document to kind of construct an ethics that is attentive to the complexities of Wei's own thought. Similarly, like, your first point makes me think about the school studies essay and the idea that when we attend to someone who's suffering, it's a creative act. Like, we take somebody who's been turned into a thing, and through that attention, they can be recreated into a subject. And so again, I think that that point is amplified by a kind of intertextual dialogue across the different essays. So thank you so much for that. Eric.
Hi, thank you, Cindy. You asked for kind of contemporary uses of this essay. So I'm a postdoc at MIT, and I work on critical perspectives on AI and data intensive technologies. And the more I dig into this field, I come to think of data as force. It's I keep coming back to this essay. This thing, this X that kind of reifies people and relations. And I also, interviewing developers and designers, there seems to be this intoxication of data slash force. So I'm just trying this half-baked idea now with you here and see how it resonates. There's this intoxication. If you have, like, data seems to take on its own life in a way. Yeah, so I'm just very half-baked, but I'm kind of curious how that kind of resonates with the
Yeah,
group.
that's really provocative, Eric. I think there are so many ways that we could spin that out, right? Like, thinking about the way that, like, power over data in our moment ends up being accruing a kind of momentum in the way of force, and the way that that can lead to really gross injustice, but also a kind of dehumanizing effect. I teach first year writing, and so my own struggles with AI are particular and fraught because there is this sort of it feels kind of like the way Vey writes about force. There is a kind of gravity pulling my students into chatbot use as an alternative to their own thought. And it's so much bigger than them that it almost feels like the idea that someone could just reasonably opt out of their own volition is, I mean, I believe that they can, but it becomes increasingly difficult with the way that it's structured and present everywhere. But also I'm thinking about like data extraction in like social media and like the mining of our information and the way that that's used, where we just become sort of fodder for this kind of late capitalist fever dream of people accruing certain kinds of power. I don't know if that's like the angle you were thinking of, but that's where my mind starts to go. Do you have other additions to that? Like concrete manifestations?
Well, mostly in terms of, I mean, I was more thinking about the act of kind of quantification itself, and once the data is available, how hard it seems to be not to put it to use. I mean, grace in the in this context is also seems to be miraculous.
Yeah.
I mean, AI is a lot about appropriating as much data as possible. And again, also in this context, it becomes difficult or problematic to talk about, you know, if both the the subjected and the subjector are kind of under will both be kind of adversely affected by by the existence of the data. Yeah, it's this is very you know, half-baked, but I find it very productive, and I found Vey's work very useful in this context. And maybe I'll write an abstract for the conference on this.
Oh, you should do that. Do that, please. Yes. I think that's a great idea. And I think that I mean, there are so many directions we could go, right? So like end user ethics in terms of engagements with AI, but then also like corporate practices and then anything in between. There are so many ethical implications, and I think it's a beautiful conversation to forge. So please do. Scott, you are back.
Okay, I have my question now. So the question I wanted to ask you, Cindy, is about you were talking in your presentation about the sort of reception of this essay in particular in the United States and around sort of like the panic after the use of nuclear weapons, Dwight McDonald, Mary McCarthy, et cetera. What I think is really interesting also about the journal Politics, McDonald's journal, is that it's one of the first openly anti-Stalinist socialist journals in the United States as early as its founding, right? So in the post-war era. So it's the sort of at the birth in a lot of ways of the same reasons that they begins to make her move away from Marxism in some cases and towards a more theological and ethical Platonist sort of understanding of war in and of itself, as well as the sort of machinations of the totalitarian states of the 1930s. What I think is really interesting in this as well is that, and maybe this is back to Gary's question, early question about fascism a little bit as well, sort of extending it, is the way that she describes war as destruction. And she writes, everyone's unhappiness is laid bare without dissimulation or disdain. No man is set above or below the condition common to all men. Whatever is destroyed is regretted. And it often strikes me, and I'm curious what you would think about this, that Vey's own understanding of history and her sort of use of, in particular, the Greeks as models for the contemporary history of the late 1930s and early 1940s tends to get lost in translation a little bit, in the sense that those of us who have received it now, we are thinking a lot about what's going on now and how it reflects to what they was going through. And what's intriguing there is that she's thinking about what's going on in her times, and she's like, well, but what about the Greeks? Right? And I'm curious, from sort of like a literary history perspective, how much you think that either did or didn't influence some of this reception, especially in the mid 20th century for English language readers. And why that's maybe one of the reasons why we often see this tension between, for example, like a radical left-wing type of they, or as I like to say, my type of they, and the sort of more like liberal individualistic reading of they that we often see.
Well, that's a great question, Scott. I think the story of Vey's reception does clarify a lot of that, but I think you're right that there are so many layers. Like it's kind of like we have our thing, and our thing is Simone Weil from more like 100 years ago, and Simone Weil thing was like a very quirky interpretation of the ancient Greeks, and that is the foundation for so much of what she did. And again, I am not a classicist, so I can't comment on the accuracy of her visions of the Greeks. But I will say that in my experience of teaching Weil to undergraduates and graduate students now in Saskatchewan in 2025 or whatever, as an American expatriate, I find that my students struggle with even understanding Vey's context in her moment, right? Like we have so much historical amnesia that the work of historicizing it's layer upon layer upon layer of historicizing. And so I think a lot of what's required for us to do justice to Vey's work is historicizing in part. So I think we need these conversations with classicists and with, all sorts of people. I also know that in the history of Vey's reception, not just in this 1945 moment, but following in the Anglophone context, her work has been important to people often in moments of kind of political struggle. So, for example, the story of Adrienne Rich's discovery of Vey, which I went to the archives and like read through all of Rich's materials at the Radcliffe Institute. It was a ton of work. I was great with child. It was a whole thing, like 12 years ago. It is apparent that Rich read Vey in the mid 60s, in part because Rich herself was coming to a kind of radicalized politics in relation to the Vietnam War and also to Black civil rights, and also then eventually to feminism, which is often the story of people's feminist awakenings. They often come through other radical movements into feminism, and that was true of mid-century women's movements as well. And so I think that that's a good reminder for us that it's not just that 1945 moment. In many cases, people who have ended up appreciating Vey as your kind of Vey, Scott, as the kind of radical leftist Vey, they have done so in moments of kind of political extremity. And I feel like we're in a similar moment at present. And I feel like that's part of what's drawing folks to her work. But it does take that kind of historical particularization because she's so easy to misread. And we probably all misread. I probably misread some things today, and we probably all misread all the time because there are so many layers of particular context that we're missing at any given moment. And each of us bring those into a conversation like this, which I think is one reason why conversations like this are so important. Kate and I were even talking about that before we started. So thanks for your question. I hope, does that open up something that?
Totally. Yeah, that was a wonderful answer. And I share your struggles at times when I'm teaching especially to undergrad political science students who are like, why are we suddenly reading about God in a class on capitalism or whatever, right?
Yeah, I get this.
But I agree as well with your analysis of that sort of like political crisis. And as you were saying it, I'm like, oh yeah, like I started reading during the Occupy movement, right? Like that's when I started reading they, and yeah, so makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Cindy.
You're welcome,
Really
Scott.
appreciate it.
What's so interesting too, though, is like some people come in a crisis of faith, right? And so we get these like really interesting competing motivations, and that's productive too. Kate, our time is almost up. Hey?
Yes, I was just going to mention we've just got a few minutes left, so maybe we could quickly get questions from Gary and
Yeah,
Teresa.
let's do it. Gary, go for it.
Thank you. I'll try to make it brief. After reading the essay, The Poem of Force, I decided to read the Iliad, and I was amazed by how much the gods were a part of this, because it doesn't come across that much in the essay, and the gods are always influencing in one way or another who's going to win or lose, and also that they imbue them with like supernatural power. So Achilles just like insanely strong, and it reminds me a lot of a Marvel movie. Like you made that comparison.
I think it's true. Yeah.
So I'm trying to reconcile that aspect of exaggerated heroism with with her saying that the Iliad is the purest and loveliest mirrors of the work of force in our society.
Yeah, again, I think she thinks it's a fantastic work of literature showing us something that is horrific. I think that it's so the content isn't what's pure and lovely, it's the mirror itself, but I could be wrong. I will say that when I found the primary text too violent for my children, I got them the graphic novel version from the library. And it is still gruesome. There's not a way around that. So in case you're wondering if this is appropriate for a 9-year-old, the answer is it depends on the 9-year-old and how many Marvel movies they've already seen, probably. Teresa?
I just wanted to add that I think they doesn't want to equalize the victim and the oppressor on the ethical level, just on the level of how the force acts on them. But I think she still thinks we have an obligation to be such that we will. I'm sorry.
I think that is a really important distinction. Hey, like the importance of recognizing that the like kind of like Kate was saying that this is maybe prior to that sort of judgment or prior to some of that. Teresa, did you want to finish your thought?
Yes. I just wanted to add the question of beauty and how it allows us to be attentive and act ethically. And it's also interesting that the study of the role of individual who transcends the force is also in the Venice Sauvé, very interestingly depicted.
Yeah, absolutely. And another place, right, where we have politics and literature coming, ethics and literature coming into conversation. I also think that the beauty and contrast, right? So I had one slide that had that image of the Grecian urn, and the what's so interesting about that art form is that it is reliant on that kind of vivid contrast between two tones. And I feel like that is consistent with Vey's idea of how what's beautiful or full of grace or whatever is in such contrast to the sort of consistent destruction everywhere else. Kate, do we have time for to hear from Dirk? Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Dirk.
Okay, thank you so much. I was wondering, since you're interested in the English language treatment of well, not so much Faye, but the Iliad. Have you read Caroline Alexander's book, The War That Killed Achilles?
No.
Because she has read Vey's essay, and you can see its influence on her introduction to the Iliad. It's just the very title, The War That Killed Achilles, gives it away. But she starts off the book with a scene of mothers receiving news that their U.S. soldiers coming back from Iraq have died. And she said, that is what the Iliad is about. It's really an anti-war poem, is what she argues in her introduction. So I highly recommend it.
That's fascinating, Dirk. Thank you for that. I love a reading recommendation. That also makes me think of the last line of the Adrienne Rich poem that we read, which is about the war memorial with the list of the names, right? That there's a resonance there with that image, that we have to remember the losses as kind of the primary kind of documented marker in the end.
Well, we are just over time. I could just stay on here all afternoon and talk with all of you about this. This is incredible. But thank you so much for your time and your incredible, rich discussion. And please join me once again in thanking Dr. Cynthia Wallace for this incredible, incredible afternoon.